Hopefully you'll catch this fantastic team at one of the breaks if you have any questions or want to hear any more information. But costume design is just one aspect of a much broader topic. Production design, sometimes also called experience design. No matter what you call it, how do we make it the right choices for the most high impact experiences? Especially at a time when the lines are really, of themed entertainment platforms are really blurred, and the industry is really changing so quickly. And what's the evolving audiences' expectations and established creative processes, what are they? So mixologist Gary Wojcinski is going to shine a new light on some of these questions through a really authentic and personal story that offers perspectives on creating a North Star and guiding your way through the design through uncharted waters. His team is also going to be sharing with you their perspectives, as well as talking about what the underlying way is of thinking that's untethered from a specific workflow associated with a specific medium, a client, a project, a platform. It can be key to better collaboration and creating a more impactful experience. So Gary's going to take it away.
Hi. Thank you to Bettina and to JP and to the TEA for having me. And I just want to say, by the way, that the TEA has been incredibly impactful for Hotop Associates as we've grown. That's my company over the last couple of years, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So like I said, my name is Gary, and I am the owner and head of creative at Hotop Associates. We're an entertainment design firm. We do all kinds of different projects, both execution and design. But to talk about North Star, I want to start a little bit with talking about myself and my background. I see I'm a slide ahead, so you already got the spoiler that I started in the theater. So I worked backstage in the theater for a long time. I started as a child actor, and got into production and setup and takedown really in elementary school. And by the time I was in high school, I was designing, I was running crews all over town. Here's a good picture. I know we saw some pictures from Craig earlier. Here's let's see, make sure this is moving forward. Am I hitting the wrong button? There we go. Don't hit the laser pointer button. So this is me in high school running stage crews. They gave me a headset and a customized t-shirt, so I was pretty much in it for my entire life at that point. And I still have the t-shirts. I don't have the hair anymore that I had here, unfortunately. Beyond that, I went to college for theater, and I pursued that as a career. Getting degrees in theater, working as a scenic designer and prop artisan for many years again. Eventually, I moved to New York to live that dream, to be a set designer and work on Broadway. But then I discovered that I really like things like eating and having a nice place to live, and that theater wasn't always the most lucrative thing for me to do. And once I got into more commercial work, I also learned that what I loved wasn't really the theater itself. It was really more the craft, the process, and the people that I got to work with. So I really did feel sort of untethered from that one discipline, and I felt like it was a gift to be able to be kind of a serial generalist for the rest of my career. And I think probably a lot of people in the TEA in here are like that too. That project diversity really drives you. It really drove me. So there's lots of different titles for all the things that I would say that I have done. Set design is the obvious one, and then we have attraction design, production design, environmental design, exhibit design. They're really all the same thing. They all mean using the physical space to tell the story. But again, this is SATE, so today what we really want to talk about is experience design. So I'm a pretty big tent sort of person. Experience design, I think, really applies to a lot of different things. Once you take the environment that we're building, for me, and add an audience, it becomes an experience. But it doesn't really matter what your craft is. You're still focusing, all of us, on that experience itself. We're really all just trying to serve an audience needs. I think if you put the audience first, some people have said that today, that's really defines you as an experience designer. And why does that matter? You know, we've also talked a lot, especially in the Craig segment, about the idea that, you know, times are changing. Like the world we live in, there's a hunger for real, authentic experiences, for connections, and connections make memories. So, you know, yeah, the things that happen where you connect to another person are the things that end up hanging on your wall for the rest of your life. Your memories with your kids, with your friends, with your family, or sometimes it's things that even happen internally for you. But when you really make that connection, it becomes seared in your brain and it becomes something that you carry with you. And I think for me, that's really the goal, is to bring that to people. So now to get back to the North Star and to kind of lean into what I mean by that idea, I want to take a quick look at the experience recipe itself. This is the formula that we see on posters and put all around when we talk about SATE. Storytelling plus architecture plus technology equals experience. But I feel like this formula maybe isn't quite telling the whole story, because it's leaving out a key thing. And that key thing is relative to 6th grade math, if you remember, the order of operations. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally if you have kids in the 4th grade, is the order of operations. So in this version, I look at the architecture and the technology as a unit that make up the physical world that I'm creating. And then they work as a magnifier for the story. You do need the story to know what it is to make those choices, but it's really the architecture and the technology combining to supercharge the story. Throw in the audience, you get an experience. So that to me matters in terms of how we approach how we work together, because there's facility integration and the combination of those crafts for architecture and technology, and storytelling is key and probably the most important, but it's not apples to apples to apples. I think it's 2 apples and an orange. But again, to get further closer to the North Star, this still doesn't tell the whole story for me. So more childhood math. So I think this equation needs a denominator, if I can be nerdy about it. And surprisingly enough, that denominator is all of you. Okay? The thing that really matters to me as an artist, as a craftsperson, and as a collaborator is that we bring ourselves to the table. And I think it's easy to forget that. When you get down the road of being invested in the projects you do and the work that we're doing, because it's commercial, I'm reminded of the Chuck Close quote that some of you have maybe heard before, which is that inspiration is for amateurs, the rest of us just show up and get to work. And I think when that's your attitude, because you're providing a service for a client, it's easy to forget that your beliefs, the things you care about, what's important to you, who you are as a human being, and the perspective and the lens with which you come to the work is really what drives all the choices you make. And you just can't take that out of the equation. So if you're at the front end of your career, or you're just out of school, you're next gen, and you're coming to this for the first time, my message to you is don't forget who you are, what you care about, and what you believe. And if you've been doing this for 100 years and you're jaded and it's kind of like you know everything about this industry, I would suggest you step back and think about the fundamentals, the basic things you cared about when you started, and start to use that as the lens to get into the work, because that's really what makes a difference. And to me, that's what that North Star is. This really represents a filter that all your choices are made through. Story, architecture, and technology are only good as those choices of the people who create them. So North Star is an individual belief. It's an ideal or a way of working. It's specific to your craft, and it works as your own guiding light that helps you to make choices around the challenges. Beyond that, a North Star gives you a shorthand to communicate. We talk a lot about collaboration and collaborative teams. Part of the reason I like to talk about the theater a lot is because, again, that's my filter, that's my access to the work, and theater is a highly collaborative art form. So my background, my youth, my training taught me that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and sometimes those parts have different perspectives, and I've had no more great joy sometimes than influencing a production or a design or a concept or an attraction through the lens that's not my job. So when I got a chance to say, oh, I have a great idea about the sound, or here's something about the costumes that I care about, that cross-pollination is powerful. And sometimes I think in the industry we work in, there's not enough opportunity for that in the way that we drive teams together. So to come up with a great North Star and to really start to frame what you think about and what you care about, I've come up with a few kind of basic guidelines. The first one is that it's simple. It's got to be easy to understand and apply. If you come to a creative collaboration and say, hey, I've got this great access in the way that we get into the work, but you can't explain it, or people that don't do what you do don't find meaning in it, it's not going to be that valuable. The second thing is it has to be authentic. It speaks to you because it's from real experience. So in a minute, I'm going to walk you through my North Star and talk about some formative experiences that helped me formulate this idea. But I think for everybody, it really matters that it's unique to you and you can be passionate about it. Also, in a few minutes, I'm going to have some guests who don't do what I do. When I got the call to be a mixologist, my first thought was, I want to talk with people who don't do the same thing that I do. Because I think what is key to the success of many projects, like I said, is to be interacting very tightly and using those people that come from a different place as a resource. And the third thing is that it's practical. So it's good to talk about what you care about and what you believe in and why you get up in the morning, but if you can't apply it, if it's not a test, if it's not measurable, if there's no way for you to use it or in a way that is concrete and that other people can understand, then it's really not that helpful. So that's my North Star, and this is this formula again. And to cut to the chase and replace that, my North Star and the way that I access the work is through the suspension of disbelief. So the suspension of disbelief is not a new idea. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it before. It is a concept that's often applied when we talk about film and kind of how we get people to buy into our stories. But for me, it's actually a practical way that I can communicate the vocabulary of the world that I'm designing and make sure that I'm on the same page with everybody else on the project. This idea was not created in the 21st century or the 20th century. It actually was first coined as a phrase in 1817. And it was applied primarily to literature at that point. It was a poet who came up with the idea, and the idea was exactly as we're talking about it. So to suspend your disbelief willingly means to set aside your rational faculties and to decide for the purpose of your own enjoyment to engage with what you're doing or reading on a level that doesn't question. Because if you're asking questions, you're not immersed, you're not enjoying yourself. Interestingly enough, about 100 years ago, J.R.R. Tolkien challenged the idea of suspension of disbelief. He said if your audience needs to suspend their disbelief, you've failed. That they should be able to come to what you're doing and you have a complete world that you can understand, and there's no need for them to willingly or unwillingly suspend their disbelief. I think what's interesting about both Tolkien and those that came before is that they were really talking about literature. They were talking about a story. For us, I think we have a whole different set of challenges. When you're talking about live entertainment and attractions and trying to help an audience stay in the moment, stay engaged, understand, really be immersed in the attraction you're creating, we have a much higher bar than somebody who's just using their imagination reading a story. I first started thinking about this again back when I was a kid watching plays, and I would work on shows and I would watch them over and over and over and be immersed. And even if I was working on it and I knew it and I understood it and I knew all the tricks, I still really all the time could love it and get into it. And then I would get into points where I would have fleeting moments sitting in an audience where I'd be watching a play or a musical, and I would look to my left and I would look to my right, and I would think, this is weird. Like, we're sitting in the dark with 1,000 people who don't know each other, watching some other people pretend to be something they're not, and at that point, it's over. You can't enjoy the show anymore once that's occurred to you. And in attractions, as opposed to theater, the bar is even higher, especially now that everything we're doing is immersive and experiential, and it's not presentational. Right now, you got to worry about everywhere people can look. You have to worry about their attention, and keeping people immersed in the story is a very high bar. And also, as the world has evolved in terms of film and television and visual effects, complete immersion, like Tolkien wanted, is actually very achievable on the screen. And for the most part, the current generation and those of us even that have been around since before that don't question it. You watch a superhero movie, everybody flies, you watch Star Wars, it doesn't matter, you just buy it. You suspend that disbelief. It's not a very high bar. Attractions is a very different story. So for me, I like to think about suspension of disbelief in terms of a spectrum. On one end is the willing suspension of disbelief. That means you're helping. You're not relying like Tolkien wanted on the complete thorough world to be created. You're actually getting involved. And a good example of this, if you think about The Lion King on Broadway, which is, in which case, if you're not familiar, has a lot of puppets in it. And those puppets are all manipulated by live actors who were there plain as day. It's based on a traditional Japanese puppet form called bunraku. And the idea is that the audience stops seeing the puppeteer. But it requires you to choose to not see it because you're immersed in the story. On the other end is second belief, and that's Tolkien's idea of a complete and immersive world. And the easy way to think of that is just to go over to Universal and go to Diagon Alley. And you walk in that space, and you look around, everything is in full scale. The buildings are as big as they would be in real life. The sky is there. You feel entirely like you're in that environment. The challenge with that, in most cases, is we often don't have the time, the money, or the space to fully immerse people in those environments. So that leaves us with a spectrum, and I would argue that 90% of the projects that I've ever worked on are not on either pole. They're somewhere in between. So my North Star is to find the space on this spectrum where the language and the vocabulary of the project lives, and also to make sure that whatever we're doing, that the contract with the audience and the audience expectation is in that same place, and I'm going to give you a few examples about that, and then to use that as the way that I communicate. So when I sit down with the rest of the team and people start making suggestions or we have ideas, we start jamming on it, where are we on this line is the main question that I want to know the answer to. And every decision I make is in service of figuring out where I am on that spectrum. So everybody's going to have a different North Star, a different way of thinking, but relative to production design, in my experience, this helps me. And I have found over time that it also helps my collaborators as a way to communicate. So I'm supposed to do some mixology, whatever that is. So, and unlike the kind of food metaphors I've heard today, I went right to alcohol. So, to give you some examples of what the different kind of ways that I could apply this as a production designer, I'm going to talk about some things again, because I do believe your North Star needs to be authentic, where I really had an experience. I mean, experience is a broad term. Everything is an experience. We were talking about the definition of experience earlier today, but to me, it's really important to benchmark those moments in your real life when you actually feel it. We're trying to create it for audiences all the time, that authenticity. So if you don't notice it when it comes by, I used to have a design professor when I was learning I'm dating myself by saying to learn to draw in perspective with a pencil. But when I was learning to draw in perspective, he used to say, go out, walk down the street and look for perspective in the raw. Where is it where you can stand on a street corner and see a vanishing point, see 2-point perspective? And, I always thought that was great to look for it in the raw. So I'm always kind of looking for that experience in the raw. When does it naturally occur? When do I feel the sensation that at the end I want an audience to have? When am I having a moment that the audience will have that is so important to them that they're going to put it in a frame and put it on their wall? So the first quick story I want to tell you is going to focus on technology. Let's see if this works. Nope, but the technology was supposed to jiggle. When I was a kid, like many young boys, and maybe girls too, I had a serious magic phase. That was probably from the ages of about 9 to 15, if I'm being completely honest. I'd like to say it stopped when I was younger, but that's not true. I was fully into magic, and I think magic is a great example of experiences driven by technology, although people don't generally really know it. Technology is behind most, especially stage magic, and the ability to go and be immersed and watch a magic show and not question it because you're enjoying yourself, I think is a great example. So my specific thing, I was into doing kids' birthday parties and close-up magic, but the person who I really looked up to, for a brief period of time, of course, was none other than David Copperfield, because look at that hair. I went to see David Copperfield in Atlantic City when I was 8 years old, and somewhere I have his signed photograph from that experience, and I saw the stage magic. And again, I was into theater at the time already, so I kind of got the jam already. Like, okay, this is stage effects. This is technology. There's mechanics behind all of this. But I didn't care. It was magic, right? So then in 1983, which some people remember, David Copperfield made the Statue of Liberty disappear on live television. Millions of people watched it. It was event television before there was event television. And, that was entirely necessary for people to not ask that question. The first question was, well, it's on TV, they're turning the cameras off. And they had all sorts of ways to have testimonials that they weren't turning the cameras off. You had David talking into his radio and saying, okay, it's go time. Then they turned the lights out, and there was silence, around the nation. They turned the lights back on, the Statue of Liberty was gone. Everybody knew the Statue of Liberty was not gone, but we wanted to enjoy that moment. And it was entirely technology, which is how they did it. And if you ask me later, I'll tell you, but because I don't want to give, no spoilers from Magic from 1983. All stage magic is essentially driven by technology. And when we come back to production design, and we think about that spectrum of belief and what we want people to do, the choices you make as a production designer for a stage show, for magic, is entirely about obscuring the technology. It's the one thing that's driving everything, and it's the one thing you don't want anybody to see. And you also don't want to ask them to ask any questions about it. So when you look at light beams and you look at dark stages, it is entirely, every choice you make is to support that suspension of disbelief. Make sure that there isn't a moment where somebody is stopping and thinking, there's definitely an arm back there, there's a crane, there's a turntable, where are they getting out of the box? You have to hide all of that, and you can use the production design to do that. So if I design stage magic, that's where I'm going to start. So my next example is a little more esoteric, if you can believe that, and that is focusing on architecture. This is St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. When I was 23 years old, I was out of college and decided to go on a journey for 6 weeks and backpack from London to Athens and back for really no apparent reason other than I could, and I went to the Vatican. Most people, when you see the Vatican, you think of the Sistine Chapel, which Michelangelo's one of Michelangelo's masterpieces. But actually, after Michelangelo completed the Sistine Chapel, which took him 7 years from 1534 to 1541, he was asked to take over an ongoing initiative. So it was a project, this is a good story too. They had started in 1506 to reinvent and to rebuild the St. Peter's Basilica. And after 34 years, they decided it wasn't working out with the architect they had. And they shifted to Michelangelo, who took over the project in 1546. He died in 1860, and it was finished about a decade later. So the reason I'm talking about the Vatican is because I actually had, for a person who's brought up Jewish in New Jersey and is a complete atheist, I had the most religious experience of my entire life standing in this building, and I carry it to this day. I think about it all the time. I took that picture on the right, standing there. It's the most powerful architecture I've ever seen. I say it's an architectural kind of dominance in the mixology, primarily because the story isn't really told in the building. They expect you to already know the story, which I did, and it wasn't something I was focused on. But when I was in that building, I had an out-of-body experience. I felt it. When I got out of the building, I started asking myself questions. How much time, how much money, how much power did it take to do this 400 years ago? But while I was on that building, in that room, I didn't talk to a person. I was with friends. I didn't talk to anybody. I stayed by myself. I mean, it was moving, and I believe that was the power of the architecture. And I suspended my disbelief in whether, I'm not going to get into a theological discussion, but I completely suspended, whatever preconceived notions I had about a higher power just because of the architecture of that building. I'm going to do this one really quick so I can get to my panel. But my last one is my favorite one, and it's also one that maybe people think about when you talk about this suspension of disbelief. You can imagine it pretty easily. And that is the WWF, professional wrestling. So here's a spoiler alert. Professional wrestling isn't real. Right. I mean, it is real. It's athletic. We've seen people get really hurt. I mean, there's physical properties to it, but it's a show, right? We all know it's a show, and nobody cares. So professional wrestling's been around for a long time. Ritual combat's been around as long as there's been people organized wanting to watch a fight. But professional wrestling in the 80s, when I was a kid, was in it. That's when it got big. So there's Andre the Giant and Big Jim Studd and George the Animal Steele. And, wrestling in the 70s was a regional thing. There were all these regional kind of wrestling fiefdoms fighting with each other. And in the 80s, Vince McMahon took over the WWF and he started muscling everybody out. And he took over the whole thing and he created a giant multi-million-dollar industry. But when I was a kid, it was on Saturday morning TV. The production values were terrible. And I even got a chance to see Andre the Giant in my high school. So, I mean, I was actually 9 years old. I wasn't even in high school yet, but they were touring high schools in the early 80s. But by 1984, 1983, they had started WrestleMania, which was the first pay-per-view events ever in the history of pay-per-view. It was a whole new revenue model, and wrestling had grown from this regional thing all the way into a huge experience that was happening in arenas. In 1987, at WrestleMania 3, there were 93,000 people in the building to watch a bunch of guys perform an athletic competition that was entirely staged because it was all storytelling. It's good versus evil. It's characters you love, characters you hate, locked into a soap opera that you want to see. And the funny thing is, nobody said anything. We were talking about millions of people watching pay-per-view. There were 160 closed circuit locations around the country so that people that didn't have pay-per-view could go and watch this thing. And there's no conversation about whether or not it's real. Like, that's powerful storytelling right there. So production design for WrestleMania, or all wrestling, is about making the choice to not blink. We can't be complicit in people questioning this reality. We have to take it seriously. Nobody ever says it's staged. Nobody ever admits it. And the production design treats it like an athletic event. It's more about setting up for the Olympics or a boxing ring than it is about show business. And if you go too far into the show business realm with it, or you start to making it too theatrical, now you're kind of violating the compact with the audience. And that's no good. So that's just kind of three quirky examples of how I look at suspension of disbelief in production design as a North Star. But, my North Star is only one out of anybody, the entire creative team, every time. And again, we said it has to be inclusive, authentic, and practical. Simple, authentic, and practical. That's an old slide. But the other thing is it's got to be relatable, and it matters. Not, like I said, not just mine, but everybody else's. So if you take my North Star and your North Star and somebody else's out of the entire creative team, you get something really powerful. You get a constellation, right? So this constellation and this kind of group mentality where all our North Stars, who we are, our experiences, our stories are an important filter for the design conversation is, to me, the single most important thing in a project being highly impactful. If you're siloed, if you're doing separate things, if you're not working together and communicating about your craft across disciplines, you're really not all working on the same show. So to talk about their North Stars and maybe ask me about mine, I'd like to bring some people up who come to design from a different perspective. So from It Ain't Shakespeare, storyteller Colette Picot, from Animax, Chuck Fawcett, and from McLaren Engineering, Andrew Habel. Gary, this will sit over here. Yeah, it doesn't matter. So I want to start by asking you guys what your North Stars are, and everybody's heard mine. So who do we decide we were going to start with now? Chuck? Okay.
I'll go first.
All right, so can you tell us a little bit about your background and your North Star?
Yeah, my background is I'm a physical character designer, and that encompasses puppetry, animatronic characters, interactive characters, anything that is not a live actor in costume. or a live actor filmed for media. So my North Star over the years has become basically this, to find your character's core. And essentially what that means is that comes from a place of story. You first have to understand the story that the character exists within, and that allows you to understand more about the character itself, and that will typically point you to one key trait that is in that character. And that can be an attitude, a quirk, a physical trait, something of that nature. But it's typically either physical or emotional. And that trait will typically allow, it will typically allow you to create an experience that is one that leaves an imprint, creates a memory or a grammable moment, if you will. But it's all about that singular trait that that character can basically emote to the audience at that point in time.
So I know that you consider yourself not a robot maker or a technologist, but more, like you said, you're looking for that single trait. That's your North Star. What is the character's trait? But what about the kind of the perspective and the way you approach your work specifically as, and a little bit about, I think, what makes it authentic for you, and how is that story and your background kind of impact the fact that you come at it from that perspective?
The authentic part, yeah. Well, I didn't always have this insight. It took me a lot of years to kind of develop myself and kind of get to where I could look at a core trait like this and use that as a tool. For me, it really started similar to your story, where from the age of 11, I went with some friends to see the Muppet movie at the movie theater, and that was my first pivotal moment of experiencing a physical character on the screen, in this case Kermit and Piggy, and kind of being changed by that. And later on in my teenage years, I had the great opportunity to meet one of Jim Henson's key designers. Kermit Love was his name, and he's responsible for creating Big Bird, Snuffleupagus, Oscar the Grouch. And I got invited to come up to visit the set of Sesame Street. And walking on the set of Sesame Street and seeing Big Bird in front of a camera performing with Mr. Hooper, it was completely real for me. And having the floor director telling them, okay, we ready for this shot? And then they go live, they perform it. And the minute that they cut, the costume handler came in and pulled the top off of Big Bird, revealing Carol Spinney underneath and his orange legs.
His Big Bird pants.
That for me was a moment where I went, whoa, that just showed me how they're doing it. I didn't really understand the why behind it, but I was completely fascinated with the technology behind that and how were they doing it. And I spent a lot of years focusing on certainly the technology part, going through different television projects, live theater projects, and really kind of developing a repertoire of things that I use that kind of brought me to this point of view.
That's cool.
Yep.
We'll talk in a second how you apply that, but before we do, I want to ask you guys too. So Colette, what can you tell us about your North Star?
Yeah, my North Star is creating history. And I will do that whether I'm asked to or not, because I find that to be a really great tool for storytelling. And ultimately, the entire creative team can use that so that we all are working from the same lens or looking through the same frame. And I was inspired to do this a long time ago, actually. I started my career as an actress. And the first show I was in, I was 6 years old. I was in a production of Volpone by Ben Jonson, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare. So I was the only kid in the show. And originally they were looking for a little person to play that role, but they couldn't find anybody, so they cast me. And I had to wear this huge head, and I was covered from head to toe. And the cool thing was, I got the final curtain call. So at the end of the show, I slid out on my knees and had that great big head in my arms, and they were like, oh, it's a little girl. And the reason I bring that up is because that was my first immersive experience. The first time I went out on stage during the dress rehearsal, I was completely transported to this new world. The characters and the set and the music, I felt like it was in a completely different place, and it was so real to me that it was just amazing. And I was so taken by it that, and actually I just was going to say that And I think that's what we aspire to as creators, because we want to transport our guests to another world so they can step into the stories that they love.
You had the experience as a performer that we want to have the guests to have, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So getting to my love of creating a history, I was so taken by this whole experience that my dad took me to the library. And we studied the Renaissance era, believe it or not. And through that, I got this love of studying history, and he and I created the backstory for my characters. So I continued to do that as an actress. Every time I was cast in a show, I would study the history of the time period, and I would create a very in-depth backstory for my character and sometimes other characters. So then when I
charge him for that?
Yeah, I know. I wish I had. But later on, when I transitioned to being a writer, I just continued doing that, and I found it to be a really useful tool for me.
Cool. Andrew, your last word. Tell us your North Star as an engineer.
Yep. So my North Star is upholding the creative intent. So I'm trying as a structural engineer designing structure inside of scenery or show sets, I'm trying my best to uphold the story and the creative concept of that element. So just as an example, if I'm designing structure inside of a piece of scenery that I have a brace or a beam or a column sticking out of the structure, depending on the situation, it may or may not detrimentally impact the creative concept and the creative intent of the piece.
Good. Well, and I think that I know leads us to kind of the next thing, both practically, how do you apply this? Like, it's great that we have these stories and things that we care about, but how do we collaborate better through them, and how do we apply those? And you and I have talked a lot about this idea with engineers and designers of the fact that it's typical to design a project and get to the end and then have it engineered. And in the experience, that we've had working together a few times, it's been quite the opposite, where you've been involved on that front end and said, oh, well, I know you didn't ask for this, but here's like 6 structural ways that we could come about this project. And, maybe one of them could look cool too, and we get to have that back and forth. So I know that it's been practical. It's super helpful for me. And, Chuck, you talked about character, thinking about what that key characteristic is. So how is that a tool that is practical that actually helps you in the creative conversation?
Well, I think some good examples of that, just to kind of illustrate, when you think about typical characters. In my world, we have a limited palette to work with, because with a human actor, you've got the fact that since you were born, you were imprinted on other humans. So you get to study facial characteristics. And when you get into live theater, you look at an actor on stage and you can change the makeup, you can change the costume. There's an infinite variety of things you can do with actors. With our world, we're dealing with silicone and fiberglass and aluminum and technology and whatnot. So we really have to be very limited in our palette. That's why I say focusing on a singular thing, like when we think of Tigger, we think of bouncing. When we think of, the Tasmanian devil, we think of spinning. Emotional characteristics, when we think of Big Bird, we think of innocence. When we think of the Queen Alien, we think of terror. So I think that knowing those things and applying them in a practical way and being able to communicate that to collaborators is really essential here. Because so many people that get involved in what we do will come into a situation and say, I've got to create a physical character and I want 30 animations in it and it needs to do this and that. It's important to go, well, no, let's talk about the story, talk about the character. Why do you want 30 animations? Why don't we focus on the key thing? It doesn't mean you're going to have one animation. It might be a more limited palette, or you focus on that singular thing and really enhance that through the sculpture, the painting, the lighting, etc. But having a real good exposure to writers and lighting and scenery and all that, I think really helps us as collaborators to come together and use those tools.
So, a lot of times we've talked a lot about collaboration and being all brought on at the same time, and things like that when possible. And we'll talk about that in a second too. But I think for you and I and how our disciplines overlap, I think this idea, for me, I'm lucky. I think production designers are typically the head of the spear, maybe along with writing. So I get to get in on pretty early, usually. But I think often something like an animatronic might be something that we would think of like, well, we know there's a character and we're going to leave a footprint for it, but we're going to get to what that is later. Why is that dangerous?
Well, it's dangerous again because I think you get too many steps ahead without looking at the big picture. And again, I think looking at my career experience, I would have embraced a situation early in my career that said, hey, come on in and do all these animations and let's spend all this money and be ambitious, because I was still focused on the how is that being done and the technology side. But again, I think as you mature as a designer, as a creator, you start to realize that's less important. The bigger picture is what's important. And I'm going to apply those things very carefully, because honestly, I want a guest to come in and remember that one thing and remember the character and the personality behind the character, not the technology that created it.
Well, for me, that means that I may need to know, what that one thing is and how complicated it is, and how much space you're going to need, so that I can know how long I can keep a guest there, right? Colette, Colette and I have worked together quite a bit, so I know your stories. So I'm cheating a little bit, but can you tell us a story about a time where you've had to provide a history when you weren't asked, and what that did for the project?
Yeah, I've got a couple of different examples. One of them, I was brought in to work on a restaurant concept for Coke. And they wanted to create this really high-end restaurant experience for their guests. And the design team had already come up with some really interesting thematic designs. So when I was brought in, I was supposed to write the narratives for those. But I thought it would be really interesting, because Coke has such a fascinating history, and especially about John Pemberton, who invented Coca-Cola, to create a concept based on that. So pretty much kind of without asking, I went ahead and did that. And the team really loved it. We called it The Red House. And the idea was that John Pemberton, I sort of fictionalized his story a little bit. The idea was that John Pemberton was a philanthropist. So I took that and said, well, what if he traveled around the world gathering artifacts during his philanthropic missions, and then filled this beautiful antebellum mansion, which was red because the Georgia clay is red, with all of these wonderful artifacts, and then brought all of his famous friends to this place. And over time, they created this wonderful ambiance, and eventually it became this warm and welcoming gathering place for people from all over the world to enjoy. And the Coca-Cola people loved this concept because it embraced their history and it gave it some context.
So, I mean, that's a great tool. And I know, we've talked a lot too, because currently a project we're working on together that actually got to a point where, I was designing the scenery, the production, the environment, based on a high level treatment that they had created, right, that the client had created. And they were handling the writing portion of the situation, but they were, the producer were movie people, right? So their context was a little bit different. They had a very minimal script, but they really didn't have what you're talking about. And what was interesting was I wasn't really worried about it. We were just doing it. My team was cranking away, and they were all sort of unhappy all the time. And I was kind of like, what's the problem? We're designing the show. And at some point they came to me and said, look, this is really running the risk of being generic. We really need more. How are we going to do this? So I went to the client and we explained it to them. Because sometimes, I will, one of the owners earlier said this idea of 1 + 1 = 3, and I think that's great. So when we can bring somebody to the table, we said, all right, we're gonna bring somebody to our team to help us, and that was you. And by providing that history, everything became unstuck, everything became unglued, and we were able to actually do our job that we couldn't do without the kind of us cross-pollinating, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And it was, it's based in a fictional location. So it really wasn't grounded in any kind of history, so I created that history. And I did something very similar for Volcano Bay. I was part of that creative team as a collaborator and a contractor for Volcano Bay. And we had this really cool fire and water volcano that was the centerpiece of the park, but it didn't have any context yet. There was not a why.
Yeah.
So together with the creative team, we developed this wonderful history about these Waturi people, fictional islanders, and suddenly we had a purpose for that volcano. It had a why.
Because you could get to your why. And,
That's right.
We all, like you said, spend a lot of time on the what and the how, but often the why is missing, and I think it's our responsibility if our clients or the producers don't provide it to work together to figure it out. Andrew, do you have a good anecdote for, kind of insisting to be a creative-led engineer as opposed to the other way around?
Yes, absolutely. I feel like many times engineering is brought in at the end of a project, and sometimes it's even seen as a checkbox, as something that just needs to be done before the project can be built. But as an engineer on the front end, we can really help with the creative process. So the project that Gary was referring to earlier, Gary, Colette, and I were actually working on the same project, and it was creating an experience for cruise line and ports. And we had been asked to all come with a concept to the next meeting. And when we got together internally at McLaren, we had so many great ideas that we brought 5 concepts to the next meeting instead of 1 concept. And I think what that helped do was kind of let the entire team see what was possible and cherry pick things from the different concepts to come up with a better concept.
Well, and the key thing there, too, you said, is thinking what's possible, because this was sort of an epic, grand scale sort of project. And, you know, we had been thinking as designers inside a certain box of reality that we thought we had to live in. And by you guys doing that and saying, no, this is the possibility, you know, this is what it could be, it expanded our mind and our imagination to be able to create more. So we'll touch one more quick thing I just want to touch on, and then we'll go to questions if there are any. And that is, you know, we've talked a lot in passing about collaboration and this idea of we form our constellation through our different points of view. We have to have small enough egos and an open enough attitude to be able to communicate with one another to make that possible. And when you do, I think we get, as vendors in this industry, we get thrown together into the soup all the time at different pieces, you know, different timings, as opposed to maybe a theater troupe or, you know, some kind of a specific house that has all disciplines within it, and you have a creative team that has trust and dialogue. We have to do that like this all the time. And I think the advantage of having a North Star, knowing what you believe, knowing what you care about, knowing your way in, is a way to expedite that process when that happens. But, you know, in your experience, just notionally, I find it's a real mixed bag of when we're all brought together. So for the owners in the room, I think the key thing that's important to me is this idea that that as much as possible, you got to assemble that creative team at one time. I think because nobody really could or can or should be working in a silo. Do you guys have like anything you can talk about in terms of projects or experiences where either the owner or the client wasn't providing that? We've talked a lot about when you're working with IP or not IP, because IP in some ways is its own kind of North Star a lot of the time, although it's still very eclectic for the different projects. But you know, in terms of working with other teams and collaborating them, one, you know, this is your chance to pitch for being brought to the table as early as you can, and two, you know, when have you had to lean in and have these kinds of dialogues, you know, that we're talking about? Anybody have a?
I can think of a few projects where collaboration has worked really well. Like one that comes to mind, we were working with Cirque du Soleil Lanuba, and I feel like their North Star is bringing amazing acrobatic shows to the world. But they're bringing in a new show called the Bamboo Aerial Act, and it was where 2 performers were interacting with a skinny ladder and a hanger bar. And it was important for them to maintain the show and to make sure that there were no limitations on the performers. So realizing that we needed to understand the show, they brought us in and let us watch the show. So we were able to understand the dynamics of the show, how the performers were interacting with the apparatus, speeds, motion profiles, and that helped us go and calculate forces on this apparatus, actually analyze it. It was an existing thing they were bringing internationally. And we found it did need to be reinforced just to bring it to US codes, but we were able to do that in a way that maintained their North Star of keeping this acrobatic act amazing.
Well, and I think it's, you know, there's 2 aspects to collaboration that, if you get really lucky, work in your favor. One is that, you know, you hope that you have open-minded owners, or, you know, the people that finance what we do, who understand how important it is to bring a group of people in early and then trust them. The second thing is you hope, in the same vein, that you've got people that aren't just narrowly focused on their craft, but actually have studied the other crafts. So they understand as much as they possibly can about the other people sitting in the room. They don't have to be the expert, but they at least are exposed to it and are, you know, students of it all the time. I know that certainly speaks for the 4 of us. And that's really where you get the best collaboration, where you can riff off each other and you know, add value from, you know, a seemingly obscure, you know, place that a solution was sitting right there and someone else provided it.
And that unity, I think, leads to better results pretty much every time, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've had some opportunities where I started off as the writer, but because of attrition, for whatever reason, I ended up being the creative director for a period of time. And it was then that I actually had the opportunity to find out that a lot of designers feel like they've been left out of the process, especially the storytelling process. And they want to be more involved in that. And when I gave them that opportunity, they took more ownership. And there was so much more pride in the experience. And we came up with a much better product that way.
Well, I mean, we talk about this concept sometimes of creative leadership, you know, and I think that's a leader that's bringing a team. You know, sometimes you have an auteur, a director with a specific vision. Other times that's highly collaborative. But I think the point is, if that creative leadership isn't provided, you have to be able to be comfortable enough to provide it for yourselves, and you have to practice the skills of doing that. And at the end of the day, that is going to raise the bar for the audience too. So thank you guys for I know that. I get excited about the kind of more touchy-feely and less technical parts about what we do, but I think it makes a big difference, and we'd be happy to take any questions or hear about anybody's North Star that wants to share it with us.
Thank you guys all so much. It was an amazing talk. I'm curious, you in particular mentioned having greater insight now at these points in your career trajectories than you had when you started out. Is there a project that any of you could talk about from your past that, knowing what you know now, you think would have made it better?
Anybody want to take that one, or I can?
I think there are a few projects that I worked on early in my career. If I had known how important it was to keep things simple, as Gary was mentioning earlier, to keep things simple. It's really great. I talk about creating these histories, but they're not necessarily guest-facing. They're mostly a tool for me and the team, and their design filters. But for the guests, it's got to be simple. To me, that's what I would tell my younger self.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's been a slow evolution. I used to say I self-identified as a set designer, and then for a long time I didn't know how to self-identify, and now I like that creative leadership kind of mantle, and it speaks more to the job that I do on a project. And so I don't think that transition wasn't really binary. And in fact, our experiences are, Andrew works for a fairly large company. Colette's is independent, and Chuck and I own companies at different scales. So for me, this kind of discovery and this journey has come out of thinking about my organization and my brand and how I scale who I am into what that company is. So there definitely wasn't this project would have been different then than it is now, because it's sort of it's been slowly raising the temperature in the bathwater. You just kind of figured it out a little bit at a time.
Well, I think we all know that none of us are perfect, and mistakes are inherent in creation, and knowing that that's okay is the whole battle. We're all products of a series of little mistakes and little opportunities over time, and that's what leads us to be experts in sitting up on stage, I suppose, right?
Yeah, I think you learn more from your mistakes than you do sometimes from
Sure.
your successes.
And I would just encourage people to be self-reflective. I think you get into habits of doing the job and kind of executing your craft and taking the time to stop and think, what am I doing? What do I like? What is the part that I'm really drawn to, and how do I really care about it? And if it's not really what you're actually doing, then it's important to pivot and to get into it from another way. Yeah.
Hi, I'm over here. So I wanted to know if you guys ever run into the issue of maybe having too many North Stars, or to put it colloquially, having too many cooks in the kitchen, and how do you deal with that?
All the time.
Yeah.
I think so. And I think the timing is important too. We've been talking a lot about getting everybody together at once and how great that is. I think that can also work against you. Sometimes where people who aren't thinking that way and who are too focused on their craft, and you can get somebody really pushing the thing that they're for. So that in terms of that timing, I think that's important. And ultimately, a project is rarely a democracy, so you still need that leadership. So I think being open and allowing, starting with that big field and then kind of culling it down to what I would call the small group, led by whoever's in charge, to be able to distill that, I think is how you fight against that. But I'm for beginning with the openness as much as possible.
I think it's important to understand what you really need. So it's you want as big a group as you can, as possible, to get all this collaboration going, but at the same time, too much is not good either. So it's like, I think that would come with experience, just knowing the group that you really need to bring together to really collaborate well.
Yep.
Anybody else?
Hello? Hi. My question was, since you talked about willingness to like really believe in stuff that's not really real, I started to answer it as like, maybe the way to do that is like spark curiosity. So if you have any advice on like how to inspire curiosity from the audience, we're not really like willing to believe in, or like try to find their own answers and try to figure out like, oh, that's how they do it.
Right.
But rather just be curious and being able to like really immerse themselves in the experience. Like, how do you go about doing that personally?
I mean, everything that you create has to be engaging, I think. You know, I don't know if we are trying to spark curiosity. I think in some cases we're not. You know, I think generally an attraction or an experience is finite. People are there for a certain period of time, and like my experience with the, the Vatican, I'm fine if you're going to go Google it later and figure it out. But if you're thinking about that while you're in it, you're really not immersed. So, I don't know, I think that curiosity of how, like the awe and the wonder, sometimes, technology for the sake of technology is I think most of us talk about really, when we talked about that, I think in other talks today, not necessarily a great idea. If you're using technology, it's to support the story, it's to support the architecture, it's for a reason, and you have, a show like Ka in Vegas, if people are familiar with it, has incredible stage mechanics. And for a large percentage of the show, you don't see them. It's magic. And then at the end, in the big finale, it becomes a set piece. And you see all these pistons and gears, and you have this reveal of how it's done. And there's usually an audible gasp when you see that happen, because they're revealing it. So in some ways, you're kind of scratching the itch of hiding it, suspending the disbelief, and then using it to your advantage and using those giant stage mechanics as a showpiece. Alrighty, well, I think that we are out of our time now, so I appreciate you guys having us, and thanks a lot.
Thanks, Gary. Well done.
Yay.